Hey everyone, Cleo here, and today I am wrapping up my reading for the month of January. So the month of January started quite slow, but I did end up getting around to my entire TBR, so I'm super happy with that. So because this is the first wrap up of this year, I'll probably have to do a little bit of an introduction to it first, so you can skip on ahead if you just want my thoughts on the books that I've read. So in 2021, I am continuing with my goal of reducing the amounts of unread books on my shelves, and as a consequence I've built in a sort of like system in which I get credits for every book that I read. I get more credits for certain books, I get more credits for books that were on my classics to read in 2021 video, I get an extra credit for those, and I get 2 extra credits for books that were on my 12 books to read in 2021 video. Apart from that, every physical read gives me 1 credit, but if it's a reread I get 0 credits. If it is a not physical read I get 0 credits, and that credit system will then allow me to buy new books. And so in my wrap-ups I will always be giving you certain numbers. So I will have the total of my TBR up here somewhere. I will also have the amount of credits acquired on screen, and then I might have, you know, the amount of books read within a month on screen as well at some point. So you can have a nice overview of how my months ended up helping me get that goal that I have. So for 2021 the goal is to get under 40 in my physical TBR by the end of the year. So, without further ado, let's dive into the month of January. There are 2 books that I read in the first half of the month of January that I talked about in my mid-month check-in, so you can go and check those out over there. So that would be All Systems Red by Martha Wells. This I read as an audiobook, so it does not count for credits. And the second one would be The Death of Francis Bacon by Max Porter. I have a separate book talk for this one out, so you can go and check out my thoughts about this book in that video. This is a book that I acquired in January, but I didn't need to use my credit system for it because it was a pre-order that I'd made before I created that system, so I decided to make an exception for it. For that same reason, I'm also not giving myself a credit for having finished it already. So this one is kind of moot in terms of my physical TBR, and if you want my thoughts on it, go check out that video that I just mentioned. And then I'm not entirely sure whether I already finished it during my mid-month check-in, but if I did, then this will be all you'll hear about it. If not, I'll go into it. And that would be Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. So this is part of my Cosmere reread. I am rereading and reading for the first time a lot of the Cosmere in 2021. This is part of a reread, so I get 0 credits for this one. So we're past the midway point of the month and I still haven't acquired a single credit. Yay! But so in Elantris we're basically looking at a fallen city. Elantris used to be sort of pinnacle of society. It was in its glory days. Everybody revered Elantris, everybody looked up to it, everybody sought them out. They could heal wounds that it seemed impossible could be healed. They lighted their cities without needing anything. They could give their people food without needing natural resources and things like that. But one day it all went down, and so Elantrians lost their powers and they became kind of shades of themselves. They started to get splotchy skin, their hair would fall out, they would lose their magic, and apart from that they would also no longer be able to heal themselves neither. They were kind of permanently stuck the way they were, and so if Elantrians hurt, they will hurt forever from now on, for example. The sort of starting point to the story is the Crown Prince of Erlon, who wakes up one morning and becomes an Elantrian. So he's cast out into the city of Elantris, which has become this very harsh place where people have lost all hope. They've very much given in to despair, and the sort of only viable solution to make your life agreeable is to join one of the 3 rivaling gangs. So Raeden's presence in that city is going to kind of stir those things up. Apart from him, we're also looking at some other characters. We're looking at Serene, who was actually engaged to marry Raeden. She ends up in the society that she knows nothing about without having the support that she was expecting to get once she arrived there. And so with her, we're definitely going to be looking at the political side of this story. It's very much a political central plot with her. And then we also have Raeden, who's this sort of like a religious person from a sort of neighboring kingdom who's trying to spread his religion, and he's aggressively going about spreading his religion. I very much loved this reread of Elantris. I did spot a little bit more problems that I had with this book compared to the first time I read it, but I definitely will say that it is a great one to read. For example, if you love political fantasy, it's a great one. If you like this sort of like look at religion and the role of religion within society. I think it does some interesting work with religion within this one. While the magic system is often considered to be the weakest because we don't see a lot of the magic system, I do definitely think that the whole plot surrounding figuring out the magic system within this one is done very well, and I really enjoyed that one. The first time I read it, that is basically one of the main elements I loved about it. And I really love the Raiden storyline because it centers around chronic pain representation, for example. And while there are some things with that I don't really enjoy, overall the representation is handled mostly well. And I do definitely highly recommend it. On that note, I will actually also be coming out at some point with a video about Elantris and disability representation, but I want to do a lot more research into that one before I actually come out with it, so it might still be a while. Next book I finished this month was Orfeo by Richard Powers. This is a story about a music teacher who in his spare time does genetic research, and so one day he places a call with emergency services because his dog is dying and he doesn't really know what to do. But that call kind of triggers an interest in what he's doing, because when the police then goes to check out his house based on that call, they see a sort of genetic lab setup, and so that kind of triggers a lot of red flags. And our protagonist, rather than, you know, staying calm within the situation, he kind of panics and he goes on the run. This is a story very much about, you know, what I was kind of expecting with this book was that it was going to look a lot more into the genetic side of it and, you know, the genetic experimentation to it. And we go into that a little bit, but I would have loved for that to be a lot more of an element to the story. We center a lot more about the musical aspect to this life. So Peter Els, the protagonist of our story, used to be a composer. He was a composer of experimental music, and so we do get a lot of information about music, and I really love those points in the book in which we would find out stories about, you know, the background to certain musical pieces and things like that. I really love those sort of elements, those sort of like non-fiction elements in a fiction story. So that I really liked. I also really love the way in which Richard Powers describes music, or describes the experience of listening to music. But overall I wasn't as intrigued about Peter Els's past life as I was with the current day time period, and I felt like we got too much of his past time period versus that present moment, versus looking in at that sort of genetic experimentation that he's doing and at the consequences of what he's doing, because that all remains a little bit vague to me at the end of the novel. So I would say, like, if you're intrigued to read a Richard Powers, I would still definitely say the Overstory that I read by him is a lot better of a work than Orfeo was, but I will probably still be picking up a Richard Powers every once in a while, looking for a repeat of the Overstory and the experience that I had with that book. But so yeah, this is my first credit of the month. Yay! Next up, we have A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. This is my first V.E. Schwab. I have not read a V.E. Schwab before this one. This is kind of a book that had been on my radar when it was first coming out, because of the cover. Let's be fair, I didn't really know what the story was about at that point in time, and maybe if I would have known, if I would have really looked into it, I would have picked this up sooner, because basically this is about parallel London. So we have these 4 parallel Londons with varying degrees of magical powers in between them, and so we're looking at a sort of like world hopper who can hop between those different Londons. And I love books set in London, so I mean that premise would have immediately got me intrigued. I love world hopping as well, and so yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed this one. In total, it's not a new favorite of mine. There are definitely things I wasn't as engaged with the story as I could have been, and I'm not entirely sure what that is about. I think the characters, in my point of view, weren't developed well enough, or in any case, I never felt like I was engaged with those characters, or like I connected to any of those characters to a certain degree that would make me want to find out what happens to those characters. I want to find out what happened because I've been enjoying the ride, and because I like seeing what the author is going to do with the storyline, but not because I actually care about what happens to the characters, if that makes sense. And apart from that, I felt the world building to be a little bit flat. I liked the idea behind the world building and the little exploration that we had about how these varying degrees of magical source, basically, how that resulted in very different Londons, in a very different world. However, I felt like the idea was there, but it hadn't really been thought through. You know, in principle, these different worlds have been separate from one another for centuries, and so I felt like it would have a very big impact, centuries of not having any power, for example, versus centuries of having a lot of powers. And I kind of felt like the author hadn't fully done the exploration of what the result on those 4 different Londons was because of that. Regardless, I'm definitely continuing because, as I said, I really enjoyed it. I really think it's super fast paced, even though I did feel like not a whole lot was happening, especially for the first half of the book. I felt like I was flying through it, but not a lot was happening, so that was kind of weird. But I did definitely fly through it in total, and I do definitely think that I enjoy it. It surprised me at times, which is always what I want from a fantasy book, and so I want to see what's going to happen from now on, because this did not end the way that I thought it was going to end, and so I'm intrigued to see what the author is going to do with this story. There's also potential disability representation that I didn't like how it was handled in this book, so we'll see how it goes with the remainder of the series. But so yeah, another physical unread book on my shelves that I read this month, so another credit for my book buying budgets. And then the big chunker for this month was Don Quixote de la Mancha by Miguel de Cervantes. This is part 1. Part 2 is on my February TBR, so this is the original Spanish edition, which is thicker than the English would be. I think the English in total is a little over 1,000 pages. The Spanish is 1,500 because it has a lot of footnotes to it, so yeah, it just takes up more pages. In that sense, I did listen to it mainly on the English audiobook. I did, for the first half, I think, of this book, read the Spanish, but then I will say that I didn't get along with the story as well as I would have hoped to, and so I didn't really put in the effort anymore to read the original Spanish versus the easy solution of listening to the English audio. But so in Don Quixote de la Mancha, we're looking at Don Quixote, who is this guy who reads too much chivalry novels and starts to imagine himself being a knight-errant, roaming the countryside, rescuing damsels in distress, punishing evildoings, and so on and so forth. However, people in the surroundings don't see his actions in that same light. They think he's being crazy, they think he's being stupid, and most of his adventures end up going very wrong. I went through phases with this book. At first I really enjoyed it. I was very pleasantly surprised with the humor in this book and how easy it was to follow along or to read it. There was some great feminism representation somewhere in the beginning of this book where you know, you have these guys complaining about this beautiful maiden who you know, when they ask her, when they share their affection with her, she says that she's not interested, and that makes them say that she is a cold-hearted bitch, and so we have that girl herself defend her honor, defend her point of view, saying that she doesn't feel like she owes these guys her affection simply because they have affection for her. So yeah, where did this go wrong? No, this was written 400 years ago. Why is this still relevant today? Why could this speech just as well be in a modern day novel and be just as needed nowadays as it was 400 years ago? But so it soon started to kind of fall into repetition. It became very circular. However, after like chapter 22 or something, we did get a lot more of an overarching plot, and so I think the characters we are introduced to in chapter 22 stay with us until sort of like the end of this part, and so we have a lot more of an overarching plot and things like that. What I do like also about Don Quixote so far is that it is unclear whether we're supposed to think of Don Quixote as mad or not, but there are definitely so many glimpses of genius with the character of Don Quixote itself that it kind of begs the question of, is he really mad or is he just being presented as mad? If he's really mad, that also begs the question of how is he being treated, because he's been treated very poorly. I think almost every chapter has physical violence against Don Quixote as a reaction to something that he does in his madness, and so there's definitely a lot to explore with the story of Don Quixote. However, it's not really engaging me enough, and I don't see the merit of it being so long. So basically we'll have to see what I think about it at the end of part 2. So far I respect it. It's the first modern novel and it definitely has greatness to it. I just think it's probably gonna be too long, and I'm interested to see whether we're gonna get any sort of conclusion. Of course, it's written 400 years ago. It had to pass through censorship and stuff like that as well. So I might be expecting a little bit too much to come out of this novel in the end, but we'll have to see about that in February. But so yeah, I finished the first part. I have decided to count both parts as a separate book because come on. And so this one and the second one are on my classics for 2021 video, so I get 2 credits for finishing this one. And then the final book of the month that I finished was The Inland Sea by Madeleine. This is a debut novel. It's set in Australia and we're looking at this girl who basically we see her life kind of fall apart throughout this book. She's very much somebody who is a risk taker. She crosses boundaries all the time, and it's very much a book that's going to be centering around the violence of our times, the dread of our times, despair. So she's somebody who's working at a sort of like dispatch center for the emergency services. So she is in contact every day, getting calls from people who are despairing, who are panicking, and so she has to patch them through to the correct services. And so that sense of dread, of violence, of emergency will permeate throughout the book. We will see it reiterated in accounts of violence against women, accounts of the violent relationship her parents had. We see it in her sleeping around with men, but as a result getting a lot of cuts and bruises, so clear it's also very rough sex, and she has to take the morning after pill a couple of times throughout this. At some point she tries to do the safe thing, and so she tries to protect herself against unprotected sex, but that also goes horribly wrong. And this sense of dread kind of builds up throughout the book until we get to sort of like end scene to this book. I think it could have ended like 10 pages before it did, because I really liked the punch of a certain sequence that we get relating to climate change. Sort of like there was this sort of like apocalyptic scene of what our future could be with climate change in mind, and I think it could have just stopped there and it didn't need to continue beyond that. But overall I still think that that ending sequence was done well. However, it does have its weaknesses. So it is in the back it kind of explains that we are looking at a great-great-granddaughter of a British explorer, John Oxley, who was looking for an inland sea in Australia. And I think the inland sea narrative is there, you know, but it isn't permeated throughout, and the connection between her great-great-grandfather and her storyline is kind of flighty at times. It is there at times, but a lot of times it's not. The ending sequence kind of seems to completely forget about this connection between the two or not do anything with it anymore. And so in that sense I felt that that was a little bit weak in this book, and because it's the title and of course then makes me think that you know, maybe that should have been handled differently. Apart from that, I think it could have done with a little bit more of a plot to give it a little bit more direction. You know, you're very much led on in this sort of like cacophony of her emotions, her memories, what she's going through, her floundering, looking for a destination, looking for direction in her life. And only at the very end do all of those sensations come together. Not necessarily in a plot way, but you know, all of that then pays out. But you do need to get your readers to that point, and I'm not entirely sure how many people will stick true with this one, for example. But it had great writing to it, and I'll definitely be keeping an eye out for more by Madeleine. But so another physical read off of my shelf, so another credit for this month. So all in all, that means that in the month of January I accumulated 5 credits, so I have 15 euros worth of book buying budget that I will eventually use. I do not have an intention of using it right now. I think the first book that I really will probably buy is somewhere in April. At the end of April there's a book that's coming out that I probably will buy. But before that, I shouldn't be buying anything. I should just be accumulating budgets because I'm gonna need it for certain plans later on within the year. But so yeah, that was my wrap up for the month of January. I hope you enjoyed it. Definitely let me know if some of these books you are interested in or you've read, what your thoughts were on them. And we can discuss them further down below. And so I hope you enjoyed this video and hope to see you guys for a future one. Bye!